And this is my training, Gamification Done Differently. Today we're going to talk about gamification, why it's so popular, kind of what elements of it are starting to feel a little dull or overused, and then get into some new ideas I have about how to continue to make gamification part of your practice in your classroom. Over my years of talking to teachers, there is this general consensus of course I want to involve games, of course I'd like to do gamification in some way, but is it becoming less effective? Is it even worth the time and energy to put into it? And so today I want to give you some ideas of how you can think beyond the traditional types of gamification. When we think about gamification, a lot of times we focus on the big five of gamification elements. I also refer to these as pointsification. These are 5 ways that gamification has really quickly become a part of all of our apps and learning experiences and kind of proliferated almost every part of technology. And so the 5 big elements that we see a lot are points. Similar to Mario, you want to collect as many coins as possible. A lot of things give us points, notifications on social media, the like counter, all of these things have been built into a lot of our networks here. Badges, most popular on places like LinkedIn where they're social, but a lot of applications and learning experiences give you badges for hitting certain goals, even if you never look at them or no one else ever looks at them. Leaderboards have obviously been a big part of society and also continue to be a part of our technology here, even thinking of things of like on the For You page or top interest page on social media sites like Twitter or X. And then progress bars, there isn't a tutorial or a learning, welcome to an application or welcome to this process that doesn't involve a little progress bar that shows you how far along you are now. And then levels, of course, organizations always trying to get you to buy into schemes such as like Delta and all of the airline points, always trying to get you to feel that you can unlock the next level by pushing a little bit further here. So these are the big 5 gamification elements, and there's actually not anything bad with them per se. They are effective in places, but I do think that I have a couple of critiques that we could explore. So again, while there's nothing wrong with this type of gamification, and I use these elements frequently, they don't work as well today because, one, they're a little bit overused. As I just described, we see these all over our society, and so if they show up in something like your classroom, they're not as surprising or engaging for students. 2, all of these methods that I just described rely on extrinsic motivation, okay? They're not exactly what I would describe as what we love about games. If you ask somebody, why do you love playing Super Mario? They don't say, because the number of coins goes up as I go through the level. I don't think that these big 5 actually capture why we love games so much. So today I want us to explore some different elements of gamification that I think really do capture what we love about games. We're going to talk about 4 elements of gamification that I'm going to call the 4 less obvious elements of gamification. We're going to talk about storytelling, we're going to talk about simulations, feedback loops, and then the joy of discovery or ambiguity. The way I'm going to talk about all of these is that I'm going to give a quick introduction of how is this actually a part of games. Then we're going to connect it into how is this supported by educational research. And then lastly, I'm going to give you a couple of ideas for things that I have seen or I have done that have incorporated these game elements into a classroom setting. We're going to start with story and narrative. We know that story is a huge part of most of the most successful games that have existed in the last 20, 30, 100 years. And we also know that it is supported by educational research. Narrative gives us a way to organize information in a way that we can easily recall it later, and then we can also use stories and characters in order to make things more engaging. This is a lot of the work that I do with organizations, is taking a high-level concept and then turning it into a story that shows us those concepts and the impact of those concepts through narrative and characters in a way that we actually care about. Okay, so the 3 ways that I use narrative and storytelling in my classroom. 1 is to encourage students to retell stories from a different point of view. Two is to use stories to organize information in a way that's easily accessible. And then lastly, I use stories and I always try to put students as the protagonist. Let's break this down. What does this look like? In terms of retelling different stories or having students tell stories with a twist, a classic English teacher assignment is, why don't you take a part of the story and rewrite it as your own? One of the ways that I would do this is in an Odyssey unit. I have students reading the Odyssey and they need to write a letter to Penelope and convince her if she should stay with Odysseus or if she should leave him. This is a way where students can actually use evidence from the text in order to make an argument, but we're doing it in a narrative way here. They still need to cite their sources, they still need to cite the pages from the book, but the overall shell of the assignment, the narrative that the students are playing in, is that they are actually trying to help Penelope here by giving her advice. The second way we can use story and narrative, again, is to organize information. So we can think about, and a great example of this is if you're doing a science lesson and you're trying to describe the entirety of the water cycle, why don't we follow the story of just one little water droplet in order to give a beginning, middle, and end to this process, which then students can connect later on to that more, scientific framework that we have for them. And then my last encouragement here is just always think about your classroom and ask yourself, are the students the protagonists? I, like all teachers, I think, like to talk a little bit too much, and one way that you can turn a lecture into students being the protagonist is to stop and propose the scenario to them. This works great in history class. You can say, we can imagine these leaders, they're going through this moment, there's these factors around them. What would you do if you were a leader in this moment? How would you react to these pressures? So always being aware here of how we can turn the script here and make the student the protagonist, kind of controlling the narrative. All right, next let's talk about simulations. It might surprise you to learn that simulation games are actually a really popular part of the gaming industry. Everything from Diner Dash, where you kind of simulate running a diner, to American Truck Driver, where you just play a video game of being a truck driver. There's even a very popular game called Power Wash Simulator where you go around with a hose and you clean things. And so these games are incredibly popular, and that might surprise you, but the reason that they're so popular, I think, connects with the reason of why they're so useful in an educational setting. And so the real power of simulation is that it allows us to play and practice with concepts without getting bogged down with the real world difficulties or consequences that exist inside of those real difficult to deal with concepts. Basically, it gives us a little playground to play with ideas, wrestle with the ambiguity, and kind of pull in different parts of ourselves to see if we can make sense of typically what feels like a game. Also, if we hit real world failure, it's not as big of a deal, so we have a chance to develop a growth mindset as we do this as well. Okay. So how do I actually use simulations in my classroom? One, a lot of times I try to simulate systems. As I said, take these big concepts like governments and turn them into a simulation that people can play with. Two is to use crude parallels to elicit behavior. And then lastly, we can take meaningful roles from the outside world and we can pull them into our classroom in a way here that makes an impact. So let's first talk about simulating systems. So one of the most classic examples of this that has been around for 50 years is talking about lemonade stands, right? It's a great way to get students to practice math problems. You opened a lemonade stand. If you sell this many cups of lemonade, how much do you make? And in fact, at one point it was used in certain job interviews to see if people had business acumen. I think it's fallen out of style since then. But Model UN is an example of another simulation where we're asking young people to kind of play with this concept, being from different nations and getting to represent that faithfully. When I teach Animal Farm, another way that I use simulations is to create really simple games that represent the different government and economic systems we're talking about, and then have students roll regular dice and have kind of rules of what happens in all of those systems. We play that with candy, and as the candy is moving around the class, classroom, you can tell a lot of students are very invested, and so they're picking up on the rules of the game, which then connect to these concepts that we discuss later. The second way that we can use simulation is to create a crude parallel to illicit behavior. So one of my favorite examples of this is a health teacher example, which is to give a student a sack of flour and tell them that they need to take care of it like it is a baby. A lot of times when health teachers do this assignment, it involves the student waking up at 2 a.m., calling into a hotline, leaving a message saying that they are taking care of the baby during this time. Now, is that sack of flour a baby? Does this actually prepare young people for having a baby? No, but I think that what it does is, because we have this prop, that we have this sack of flour, and we're saying treat this like a baby, we're able to push students' behavior even farther than they typically would, to do things like call us at 2 in the morning in order to show that they are taking this simulation seriously. So you don't necessarily need to do that, and I don't necessarily agree that students should be waking up at 2 in the morning to call a hotline. But this is an example to show you, if we take something and say, this isn't a sack of flour, it's a baby, this isn't a classroom, it's a democracy, and we make these crude parallels, then we're actually able to push students a little bit farther as they role play and get into these scenarios and simulations a little bit deeper. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is taking meaningful roles from the outside world and pulling them into our classroom. I'll use 2 creative writing examples here. One, when I was having my students put on plays, to give each student an actual role and ask them to write about it from that perspective. Always engage students in terms of feeling a sense of responsibility. This can be really, really simple. When I was doing my short story unit for that week, we would decorate my classroom and we would call it the Netflix Writers Room. And the winner of each class was going to have their short turned into a show on Netflix. Obviously, I don't have the power to give this to Netflix executives, but what I did is I had one of my friends who's a TV writer actually read the scripts that won the little contest that we held. The students took it so much more seriously just because we said, no, this isn't Mr. Kablinski's classroom anymore. This is the Netflix Writers Room. And for this week, we're going to treat it like that. We're going to act like professional writers. So making those real world connections, even just, again, saying this isn't a classroom, it's a democracy, can help us push things a little bit farther in these simulations. Okay, next we're going to talk about feedback loops. Feedback loops are actually the only reason that people play games. Feedback, whether you win or lose, is what keeps gamers coming back, right? And so why is it that this thing that is so engaging, passing or failing in a game, is so daunting and a lot of times so unfun in schools? And so I think that a lot of that comes down to the fact that when video games give us feedback, a lot of that feedback is very lightweight. It's formative feedback in a lot of ways, and it's immediate, which allows us to react to that as well. And so when we think about feedback as immediate, non-threatening, and formative, we can actually create these kind of environments that are responsive to student actions and feel more like a game as opposed to an evaluation of who you are. Okay, so how do I use these feedback loops? 1, I always do rough draft with constraints with my students. 2, I try to put them in front of novel audiences so that they can share their work as much as possible. And then 3, I try to use feedback games and rituals in order to reduce the blow of the feedback that they are receiving. Let's get into the specifics of these. So first, rough drafts with constraints. When students show up to my 9th grade literature class, I don't assume that they have any skills. And so I never let students just sit down and write a paper. Instead, we start by breaking things down into its component parts and putting constraints on it. Students cannot begin to write in my class until they have shown me an outline that shows that they have captured a strong main idea and 3 pieces of evidence that support that main idea. If we can't get to there, there's no reason for you to actually open up the laptop and start writing, because you don't have the structure that I'm looking for. So by putting these constraints on students and actually saying, opening the laptop is level 2. Level 1, you need to get immediate feedback from me, which typically looks like a check mark as I scan their ideas, but it's this lightweight feedback that lets us know, okay, you are ready to move on to the next step. I'm not going to let you get too far into the deep end without checking and making sure that you have the tools that you need. Secondly, I make sure that I put my students in front of novel audiences so that they can share their work. Think about what it feels like to put your work in front of somebody else, to have something you're really proud of and have somebody else from the outside come in and affirm that pride. This looks like everything from doing a turn-in talk with your neighbor in order to share off your ideas, to more class presentations, to having mentorship programs where 7th graders are showing off their projects to 4th graders. Anything that we can do here where you are basically asking somebody to prepare and present it out to a new audience is going to make that feedback cycle feel a little bit different. Typically, we as teachers are the only judge of people's skills. When we can bring in another audience, it gives this reinforcement to the feedback loop and brings a little bit of joy into the classroom. The last thing I'll talk about is making feedback easier and more lightweight by using rituals and games in order to just make it a part of daily classroom life. Lastly, a great way to just kind of reduce the anxiety around feedback is to incorporate feedback games or feedback rituals into your classroom. When students are giving presentations, one of the things that I try to normalize is that everyone is going to receive feedback. So students have a stack of Post-it notes on their desk, and as they are audience members, everyone is expected to fill out one Post-it note worth of text that says one thing I liked about your presentation and one thing I thought that you could improve. At the end of the presentation, there's a flurry of Post-it notes that go across the room, and it's just kind of normalized that everyone is going to receive a feedback on their performance. The feedback on the sticky notes has nothing to do with their grades. It's just advice for how they could become a better performer. Another way that you can do this is by giving sentence starters to make sure that feedback is kind of going towards the student in the way that you like. Some of my favorites are I like when you, I wish that you, and what if you, in order to kind of compliment, criticize, and give new ideas. As long as we understand that everyone is going to receive this feedback and that it's for your benefit, it doesn't matter what mechanism we do it in as long as the student receives it and feels that it's for their benefit. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the joy of discovery, or in some ways you could call this category ambiguity or intentional ambiguity. As educators, I think a lot of times we're told and we're trained in a lot of ways to communicate as clearly as possible and reduce the barriers of entry as much as we can. But that's actually not what we love about games. And sometimes what we love about games is the ambiguity that we have to uncover, or the fact that things are difficult to get to. And so as we think of our educational experiences that we're designing, sometimes it is actually more helpful to put intentional challenges in there. We know that it's moments of grappling or desirable difficulty where students are actually doing the most learning as they try to extend their zone of proximal development. So sometimes being ambiguous can actually engage the learner process even more. Okay, so how do I use this joy of discovery in my classroom? One, I let my students get lost so that they can be found. Two, I try to create planned adventures as much as I can. And then three, as I said, I try to bring in meaningful ambiguity into the classroom. In terms of letting students get lost so that they can get found, when I travel with students, one of the things that we do is give them paper maps of the area and encourage them to put off using their maps on their phones for as long as possible. Basically, I'm encouraging them, do what you can with the information that's in front of you and go to outside sources later, something that we don't typically encourage our students to do. Obviously, you can't do this if you're not traveling with students. A way I do this in my English classes is to actually, when I'm having students write poetry essays, I take the poetry and I fold it into an envelope shape and I just write a poem about love. And the students have to go on blind dates with poems. They have to sort through the poems, find one that they like, and then they have to write a literary analysis about that. Because they picked the poem, because they spent time going through and deciding, oh, this is definitely the best poem that I want to write about, they feel a sense of ownership over the poem, but ultimately I curated all 15 of the choices, so I'm letting them get a little lost knowing that they're going to find a correct choice. The second way that I use the joy of discovery here is by trying to do planned adventures. This is obviously difficult and takes a lot of work to do something like a choose your own adventure style. It's a really fun format for presenting information, but requires a lot of labor. I'll say that this is one of the places where I use generative AI in order to say, hey, take this concept and turn it into a choose your own adventure. I know that Phobos also hosts some tools that allow you to create an escape room inside of your classroom or inside of a Google form very quickly here so that your students can do that exploratory in kind of a very contained environment here. The last way that I use the joy of discovery is by meaningfully including ambiguity in my curriculum and in my lessons. And so here I have two examples. One is a political cartoon and the other is this classic image. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? These kind of artifacts that you can put in front of students and say, what do we believe that this is trying to say? As long as we don't come down on the authority as the authority of saying this is definitely a rabbit or this is definitely a duck, students have more space to kind of explore, make their ideas their own, and say, no, I really believe in this. If you want a easy way to kick off debate prep in your classroom, ask your middle schoolers if a hot dog is a sandwich. These kind of ambiguous questions that we can put forward to our students and then create space where we're almost hands off and allowing them to create their own meaning is going to generate more engagement. All right, so to conclude here, most gamification that we see out in the world falls under one of these big five. There's nothing bad with these things. I use these things. I put progress bars on everything I build because they're helpful, but these aren't actually the things that we super love about games, and so we need to broaden our minds when we think about gamification. And so I encourage you to experiment with storytelling, with simulation, with feedback loops, and with the joy of discovery, and see if you can bring more joy into your classroom by incorporating the parts of games that we actually love into your educational practice. Thank you so much for playing with me. Please reach out and tell me if this was effective and helpful for you, and please share your ideas and your games that you built in your classroom.